Okay, imagine this. You're at a big international forum, pretty tense atmosphere.
Right.
And Senator Ted Cruz, prominent Texas voice, he just throws out this really audacious
Yeah,
suggestion,
man.
basically saying Canada might as well just become the 51st U.S. state.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds like something out of a political thriller, doesn't it?
Exactly. It sounds like a movie plot.
And you had these two sort of heavyweights facing off in Geneva. Senator Cruz, chairing the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee, known for,
Yeah.
well, his strong takes.
Hmm.
And then Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada, former big player in global finance.
Right. And the setting, the Palexo Convention Center, just adds to that feeling of, a significant moment, potentially pretty contentious.
Definitely set the stage.
So what was the spark? What actually kicked this off?
Well, Cruz apparently zeroed right in on the economics, the ties between the countries.
That trade dependence.
Exactly, pointing out that huge chunk, something like 70% of Canada's exports head south to the U.S.
And he didn't stop there, did he? He brought up the auto tariff threat from a few years back.
He did, basically laying it out like, look, you're this reliant on us economically.
So the question was kind of hanging there. Why fight it? Just join us.
Pretty direct.
So, okay, for you listening, our mission in this deep dive is to really get under the skin of this whole exchange.
Yeah, what were the core arguments being thrown back and forth?
Were there any, surprise counterpunches, things you didn't expect?
And ultimately, what does this whole thing reveal about the bigger picture?
Yeah.
International trade, sovereignty.
What it means to be a nation, even how a nation sees itself.
Precisely. So maybe we start with Carney's first response.
Mm.
How did he handle that initial, pretty provocative suggestion?
Well, apparently he didn't get drawn into a shouting match or anything.
Right.
He kept it calm, measured, but very firm, basically stating, look, Canada's a sovereign nation.
Right. Not just some commodity to be absorbed.
Exactly. And he immediately tried to flip that economic dependence argument on its head.
How so?
He pointed out that actually, since those tariff threats were first mentioned, Canada had managed to boost its exports somewhere else.
Oh, interesting. Where?
To Europe by 20%.
20%.
Okay.
So that immediately challenges the idea that they're completely reliant on the U.S. market.
Right. It kind of highlights how nations can, adapt. They seek out other markets when they feel pressure.
It shows agility, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, a strategy, not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yeah, exactly. But then Cruz, he escalated things visually.
Visually, what did he do?
He unveiled this 3D model.
A 3D model
Of what?
projecting a pretty significant hit to Canada's economy if those full tariffs were ever implemented, like a 15% drop in GDP.
15%. Wow. That's quite a tactic. Very dramatic, designed to show potential pain.
Definitely shock value.
Yeah.
But what's the insight there, using those kinds of projections in these talks?
Well, it shows how economic data, even hypothetical projections, right, can become a tool, almost a weapon, in diplomatic sparring.
Cruz was essentially using the fear of a potential future downturn to try and bolster his argument for annexation, basically.
But Carney didn't just let that stand, right? He came back with numbers, too.
He did. But focused more on the present reality, he talked about Canada's actual economy.
Which is pretty substantial.
Yeah, it's a $2.1 trillion economy. Ninth largest globally, he pointed out.
And diverse, too, right? Not just resources.
Exactly. He highlighted the strong service sector employs, 75% of Canadians? Plus that big resource industry, especially hydropower.
Didn't he mention a figure for hydro, like powering a huge portion of the country?
Yes, 62% in 2024. So he's painting a picture of current strength and diversity.
So you've got this contrast, Cruz's future projection of doom versus Carney's picture of present economic strength. What does that tell us about how they frame their arguments?
It really underscores how you ground your arguments. Carney countered that hypothetical threat with the tangible reality of Canada's robust economy right now.
Then Cruz shifted tactics a bit, didn't he? Tried to focus regionally.
Yeah, he aimed at Alberta, appealing directly to businesses there.
Suggesting what? That they'd have more in common with Texas than Ottawa.
Sort of. Hinting they might prefer Texas. Maybe even suggesting new plants could be built there if they were more aligned.
That feels like a deliberate attempt to maybe find some cracks, exploit internal divisions. Is that a common tactic?
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic move in international relations. Trying to leverage regional issues or tensions within another country for your own advantage.
But Carney pushed back on that.
He did. His response was all about Canadian unity, stressing Alberta's vital role within Canada.
And he brought up trade deals again, right? To counter that sort of inward-looking suggestion.
Yes, he mentioned Canada's, I think it was 14 free trade agreements with 51 countries, including the big one with the EU, CR.
Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement.
That's the one, pointing out it had boosted EU exports by 10% since 2016. So reinforcing that Canada is looking outward globally.
So while Cruz is looking for internal fault lines, Carney's basically saying, look at our strong overall structure and our global web of connection.
Exactly. And those agreements, like CETA, they provide a real buffer. They show a commitment to multilateralism, reducing reliance on any single partner.
Okay. Then the conversation moved towards resources and environmental stuff.
Yeah, Cruz acknowledged Canada's lithium reserves, obviously important for batteries, EVs, all that.
Big deal right now.
Huge. But then he criticized what he called environmental red tape.
Ah, the regulation argument.
Right. He even floated this idea that Texas could somehow turn Vancouver into a better logistics hub if Canada just loosened up its rules.
That really throws different priorities into sharp relief, doesn't it? Economic development versus environmental protection.
It certainly does. Cruz framed regulation purely as an obstacle to progress, which is, common viewpoint in some circles.
But Carney defended Canada's stance.
Strongly. He defended their environmental standards, but also linked it to respecting Indigenous communities. He made a point of saying Canada was the first G7 nation to actually legislate UNDRP.
The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Yes, back in 2021.
Yeah.
Specifically linking it to achieving sustainable development.
So framing environmental and social responsibility not as a barrier, but as part of sustainable growth?
Precisely. And he backed it up with trade figures, too, mentioning Canada's, $637 billion in goods exports in 2024?
Achieved with a relatively small population.
Yeah, showing they can be a major global exporter while upholding those standards. So what's the takeaway when you see this clash play out internationally?
Well, it really highlights how important sustainability and ethical sourcing are becoming in global trade. Nations aren't just judged on GDP anymore.
Their environmental and social records matter more and more. And that UNDRAP reference is key signaling a model of development that actually includes Indigenous rights.
Then things got even more interesting because other countries chimed in, right? Germany's minister.
Yeah, Germany's Minister of Economic Affairs asked about Canada's trade diversification. She noted Asia was up to 15% of their exports.
And she also pointed out the cost of those U.S. tariffs to the U.S. itself.
Exactly. She mentioned an estimated $10 billion in lost U.S. exports, which adds a whole other layer, right?
Absolutely. It shows the ripple effects. Unilateral actions can backfire, and it kind of validates Canada's diversification strategy.
Definitely. And Carney ran with that. He mentioned 12% export growth to Asia just in 2024, ongoing talks with India.
And he brought up the Toronto Stock Exchange, too.
Yeah, cleverly mentioning its $3 trillion market cap, positioning Canada not just as a resource exporter, but a global financial player built on, Canadian values.
So he's consistently countering that narrative of dependence by showing global reach and financial muscle.
Strategically demonstrating independent economic clout and global standing, pushing back hard against that idea that their fate is tied only to the U.S.
Things got a bit personal after that, though, didn't they? Cruz took a jab at Carney.
It seems so. He brought up Carney's time working abroad, London, New York.
Trying to contrast it with himself being there, listening to the people.
Yeah, felt like an attempt to question Carney's connection, his Canadianness maybe, undermine his standing.
What does that tell you when the arguments shift to the personal like that?
Well, often it means the core policy arguments aren't quite hitting the mark, so you try to undermine the person. It could be a sign of maybe desperation.
But Carney had a strong reply.
Apparently quite powerful, just firmly stated Canada is his home. And then he pivoted back to values, fairness, sustainability.
And he threw in some stats to back it up.
He did. Mentioned Canada leading the G7 in economic freedom, according to the Heritage Foundation for 2025, and being a core WTO member.
So he reframed it, turned the personal jab into a chance to reaffirm his commitment and Canada's global standing based on its values.
Very effectively done, it seems.
And the international interest kept going. India and Brazil asked questions.
Yeah, which broadened the discussion again. India's minister asked about sustainable development, especially with lithium, and how Canada's approach fits with India's own net zero goals.
Relevant connection.
Very. And Brazil's minister was focused on regional unity, worried about Alberta's energy sector being pulled south by U.S. economic pressure.
So these questions showed this wasn't just a U.S.-Canada spat. It had wider implications.
Absolutely. Sustainability, resource management, regional stability. It touched on big global themes.
And Carney's answers stayed consistent.
Seems so. Kept emphasizing sustainability, indigenous rights under UNDRP, national cohesion. He even mentioned a $1 billion regional development fund from their budget.
Showing practical steps to support that cohesion.
Exactly. Painting a picture of a Canada that's, economically strong and value-driven in a way that resonates internationally.
Okay, then came what feels like a really pivotal moment. Carney played a video.
Yeah, that was apparently a real turning point.
What was it about? Not just more stats, I assume.
No, it was described as very human, very emotional, an appeal to Canadian unity.
How did they show that?
By featuring voices of everyday Canadians.
Yeah.
From all over. Fishers in Newfoundland, farmers in Saskatchewan, people in Nunavut, all talking about what being Canadian meant to them.
Wow.
And it ended with the flag, the anthem, Parliament Hill. A really powerful visual and emotional punch that went beyond just economics.
So you can see how that would shift the mood. Did it work?
Reports say yes. Very positive reaction from the other delegates. The German delegate apparently stood and applauded.
Really?
And Japan's Prime Minister expressed admiration. Even Cruz seemed a bit, taken aback.
It's a reminder that sometimes, national identity, shared values, that can be just as powerful as economic arguments on the world stage.
It was a smart move. Tapped into that deeper sense of pride and unity, providing a stark contrast to Cruz's more transactional approach.
So in the final stretch of this exchange, Carney really seemed to consolidate Canada's position.
Yeah, he hammered home the strengths. Strong trade with Europe, strong trade with Asia.
The unity of the provinces.
Right, and framing Canada as a partner, someone you collaborate with, not someone who, quote, kneels.
And he brought up that $10 billion cost to the U.S. again from the tariffs.
He did, and highlighted Canada's own strengths. High-tech in Waterloo, AI in Montreal, its role in the Arctic Council, G7, G20.
Listing those credentials.
Yeah, asserting Canada's place. And apparently even Cruz kind of acknowledged he might have underestimated Canada. The moderator, Amal Clooney, basically declared Canada the winner of that round.
Interesting. A clear assertion of confidence then. Canada standing as a significant global player, not just, the neighbor to the south.
Exactly.
And the immediate aftermath. What happened right after the debate?
Well, Carney made that comment about grabbing a Tim Hortons coffee.
Very Canadian. A way to lighten the mood.
Totally. A very Canadian touchstone. It kind of diffused the tension. And then you had that handshake with Japan's PM becoming a symbol.
With international support.
Looked that way. And online, apparently, there was this wave of Canadian pride. The phrase, Carney schooled Senator Cruz, started trending.
Wow, okay.
And even when Cruz later posted something hinting at a round two, Carney's response was apparently quite defiant, talking about Canada's resilience.
So those reactions, they tell us this exchange really resonated, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. It captured a moment of national pride, a feeling of having stood up for sovereignty and values on a big stage. That Tim Hortons bit was pretty genius branding, really.
So wrapping this up for you listening, what are the big takeaways from this deep dive? It clearly wasn't just, political theatrics.
No, not at all. It really shone a light on fundamental differences in how nations see sovereignty, how they approach trade, their place in the world.
And Canada, despite being, the smaller country in that head-to-head,
presented a really strong, unified front, emphasizing diversification, values-based development environment, indigenous rights, and the importance of international partnerships.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you to chew on. We know the global economy is super interconnected. So how do these kinds of very public disagreements, especially between countries as close as the U.S. and Canada, how do they actually reshape our understanding of national power and influence today in the 21st century?
Yeah, and what are the lasting effects? What are the ripples from a clash like this?
It definitely makes you think about the changing dynamics, doesn't it? How nations assert themselves now. It's not always just about size or military might.
It's complex. There are diverse ways to show strength and protect your interests in this global landscape.
Well, we'll definitely keep an eye on how these dynamics play out. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.